I am really excited to welcome you to today's webinar entitled DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, Updates and Strategies. My name is Briana Broberg, and I am the Welcoming Communities Coordinator at Welcoming America. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, Welcoming America is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that believes that all people, inclusive of immigrants, are valued contributors and vital to the success of our communities and our shared future. Our Welcoming Network is made up of over 300 local governments and nonprofits doing amazing work that creates environments where everyone can thrive. And if you'd like to learn more about Welcoming America, please join us on our website, which is welcomingamerica.org. Before we begin, I did want to share just a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions at any point during today's discussion, please use the chat or the Q&A feature to ask those, and our speakers will respond to as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion toward the end of today's presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and as a registrant, you'll receive a link to the recording in the next few days. And the webinar will also be added to the resources area of our website, welcomingamerica.org, so you can access it there at any time. And now I'd like to introduce you to the distinguished speakers that are joining us today. We're being joined by Krsna Avila and Veronica Garcia, both staff attorneys at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And now I'm going to turn it over to Krsna to start today's discussion.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for having us today. I think this is a very important topic, and I know all of you care about this issue so much. There are a lot of questions about DACA and the future of DACA. So we're here to do our best to answer those questions and provide updates on what's been happening in the land of deferred action for childhood arrivals. Next slide, please. And I believe the chat now is working. I saw a few questions about that, but you can feel free to use the chat throughout the presentation to ask any questions. And then at the end, we'll have some time to stick around to answer those. So first of all, just wanted to talk about the Immigrant Legal Resource Center and who we are. If you don't know us, we're based in San Francisco, California, but our work is nationwide with offices in DC and Texas, and then throughout the state of California. But we focus on three main areas. First, we build capacity in the immigration legal field. We provide technical assistance and trainings to attorneys, paralegals, district attorneys, judges, and others who are working with immigrants throughout the country. Second, we work on policy advocacy, changing and passing laws that help protect immigrants. And we do this on different levels, so on the federal level, state level, and local level as well. And then lastly, we partner directly with immigrant communities throughout the country in doing our work to help amplify the various immigration issues, and then to also help keep our work grounded. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have a pretty packed agenda today. First, we'll talk about, a lot of you have questions about the rule, the DACA rule. I'll talk about what that is in a little bit, but basically provide an update on the rule and how that's interacting with current litigation around DACA. Then my colleague Vero will lead us with a discussion around DACA renewals, what people should be doing right now while we're waiting for an answer as litigation resolves. And then we'll switch over to talk about advance parole and why we should be encouraging folks to be traveling if they can, if they have DACA. We'll then switch to talk about other immigration options. So we know DACA is temporary, and we want to do the best that we can to screen, to make sure that DACA recipients are screened for more permanent remedies like a green card. And then also a lot of you had questions about, well, what happens if DACA ends? How can we support them in earning a living and getting paid And so we'll talk about some of the great work that some of our partner organizations are doing to help people, even without DACA, earn a living financially. And then lastly, Veronica will conclude the presentation. We'll talking about possible legislation. So there are some bills in the federal government that might provide a pathway to citizenship. So she'll talk about that. And like I said, we'll stick around to answer any questions that you all have throughout the presentation. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. I mentioned, I saw that many questions were around this DACA rule that just was supposed to be implemented on October 31st. So we'll first spend some time talking about that. Next slide. So just first of all, what is this rule doing? So the DACA rule is something that the Biden administration tried to do in order to basically protect DACA a little bit more. So as many of you know, DACA was announced back in 2012 by President Obama. And the way it was announced was basically by a memorandum. So the Obama administration decided to just implement the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program through a letter. And so as many of you know, a lot of the litigation that's going on around DACA is just based on how DACA was announced in the first place. And they're saying, hey, wait a minute, when you create something this big of a program, you're actually supposed to, under administrative law, you're supposed to give a chance for the public to provide comments and give input before you implement such a big thing. So basically, this rule seeks to remedy some of that litigation concern and so the Biden administration decided to go through what's called a notice and comment process. So as many of you know, before the rule was even implemented, it first published the proposed rule last year, where it gave a chance for the public to give comment and input. And then so the Biden administration then went back, read through all those comments, and then that rule was supposed to come into effect October 31st. But basically the DACA rule keeps the same requirements as the original program under the Napolitano memo in 2012. So it doesn't do really much changes. I mean, there's a few changes that I'll talk about in a little bit, but for the requirements, it doesn't do much. So the persons who qualified under the original program, it's the same requirements for under the new rule. But basically what it would do is that the rule would replace that original 2012 memo. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's really no difference between the rule and what was announced in 2012. That being said, there are some differences from what they had proposed last year. So and what they announced afterwards, after they read through the comments. So one of the things that they were trying to do under the proposed rule was separate out deferred action from the employment authorization. So as many of you know, right now under DACA, the benefits are, one, you get deferred action. So that's the part that protects you from deportation. And then you also get the other benefit of being able to get an employment authorization to be able to legally work. So what this proposed rule would have done was separate those out so that people would have an option to apply for the employment authorization. So under the final rule, that's not separated out. So now people have to, if they're seeking deferred action, they would have to also apply for the employment authorization. One of the other things that it didn't do was that right now for certain people with criminal convictions, as many of you know, one of the requirements is that you can't have certain criminal convictions or offenses in order to receive DACA. And so under the original program, it allowed for what are called expunged convictions. So different states allow you to go back to the criminal proceedings to, for example, lower a felony to a misdemeanor or to clear that conviction from your record. And so the proposed rule would have actually gotten rid of those. So it wouldn't recognize expunged convictions, which was a huge problem for us. So luckily under the final rule, it said that it was still gonna accept expunged convictions and recognize those. The other thing is that under the rule, it would require what's called a notice of intent to terminate. So right now with DACA, if the government wants to terminate your DACA, they don't have to give you notice. They can just say, hey, this is the letter, we're terminating your DACA for X reasons, and you don't really have a chance to argue that you're still eligible. So under the rule, before they can terminate DACA, they would have to send this notice first, which is a good protection to have. So for example, if the government says, hey, we think this criminal conviction actually disqualifies you, the person can say, hey, I got an expunged conviction now. I want to give you the evidence before you even terminate. So it gives you that extra layer of being able to argue that you're still eligible for DACA. And then lastly, it still protects information about DACA. So that's important because we know if DACA ends one day we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but if it does, at the very least, that protection of information of people applying for DACA, what's in those applications, wouldn't be used for deportation purposes generally. I mean, there are some exceptions for national security. If the administration finds that the person's a risk of national security or public safety, and we're talking about probably very egregious crimes, then in that case, they can use that information to try to deport the person. But other than that, they're saying that the information is still protected. And so ICE, they're not sharing this information with ICE, and they can't use that to try to deport the person. Next slide, please. All right, so now let's talk about the actual litigation. So many people might be confused because there's been so many court cases about DACA since Trump came. And some of you might remember that, hey, wait a minute, didn't this case go up to the Supreme Court back in 2020? Didn't the Supreme Court already decide this? Why are we still litigating this? And the thing is that there's some differences between that litigation and what's happening right now. So the main argument about around that litigation in 2020 that was in front of the Supreme Court was all about how Trump had tried to terminate the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And basically it was us as advocates who were saying Trump didn't go through the right process, and before he was able to terminate DACA, he had to, for example, give notice to the public. He had to go through the proper procedures. He couldn't terminate it just by giving a letter the way he did. So the court in that case agreed, and they said that Trump had terminated DACA unlawfully and basically allowed DHS to continue with DACA. This new suit, however, is different because this new suit is not brought by advocates. It's brought by a bunch of states, including led by the state of Texas. And they're basically arguing that DACA itself is unlawful. And I mentioned one of the main arguments is that when it was first announced in 2012, all that the Obama administration did was announced DACA through a memo. And so again, it didn't go through the right procedure. And so that's what they're arguing, and that's what this new litigation is about. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, July 16th of 2021, the U.S. District Court of Southern District of Texas basically sided with the state of Texas and held that the DACA policy was unlawful. So it vacated that original 2012 memo, and it issued a permanent injunction prohibiting the government from continuing to administer DACA. But at the same time, it temporarily stayed the decision because it recognized that so many people have come to rely on DACA. So it allowed for people who have DACA to continue renewing while the litigation continued. So it stayed that the decision, and it gave the government also a chance to rectify some of the arguments that the state of Texas was doing. So it remanded the case back to DHS to try to fix those issues. Next slide, please. So where are we now? So basically after that decision, the government appealed to the Fifth Circuit, which was the higher court after the district court. And the Fifth Circuit on October 5th, unfortunately agreed with the district court and said that, yeah, the DACA program under the Napolitano memo in 2012 is unlawful. But because by that time, the Biden administration had introduced this new rule, and the new rule wasn't part of the litigation, what the Fifth Circuit did was that it sent the case back to the district court so that the district court could now take the rule into account and also see if that rule is different or if it's also unlawful. So what ended up happening was that a few weeks ago on October 14th, that district court basically said, okay, while we continue litigating and sorting out whether this rule is unlawful, we're going to apply the injunction that was applied to previously to the memo to this new rule, so that at least for now, the rule can go into effect while we continue arguing the merits, meaning that we continue to have arguments between the parties to see if the rule is legal or not. But it also did what it did before, which was that it stayed the injunction to allow for renewals to continue. So that just means that, at least for now, initial applications aren't being processed and aren't being adjudicated by the government. Next slide, please. So what's next? So basically, we're back at the district court level. Right now, we're just, again, waiting for the decision by the district court on whether the rule is unlawful or not. After that decision, we're kind of stuck again with that either party, either the district court says that the rule is lawful, which would be great for us, or it says it's unlawful. But either way, either party can appeal once again to the Fifth Circuit. So because it's, again, we're now dealing with the rule, and the Fifth Circuit didn't take that into account. So we would be, again, having the choice to appeal to the Fifth Circuit, or we can go straight to the Supreme Court. But I think overall, I mean, the judge in the district court is Judge Hannon, which ended, if many of you know, the DAPA program, which would have basically opened up DACA to parents and other people who weren't eligible under the original program. This judge ended that program. So we're not hopeful. We think it's going to be a bad decision. And then even if we appeal to the Fifth Circuit, we already know how they ruled on the original memo. We don't think it's going to, I think the future looks pretty, it doesn't look good for us. So I think that's why people are kind of worrying and thinking about what are we going to do in case DACA ends. And that's what the presentation, the next presentation will all be about. Next slide, please. So where does that leave us with the lawsuits is that at least for now, DACA recipients can continue renewing and should renew. And Vero, my colleague Vero, will talk about that in more detail in a little bit. It also means that previously issued DACAs continue to be valid, at least to the expiration date. And then again, DACA recipients can and should seek advanced parole to travel abroad if they haven't done so already. And I'll talk about some of the red flags where maybe in some cases they might not want to travel, but in most cases, we do want to encourage folks to travel And so that's where we're at now. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to Vero to talk about DACA renewals for a little bit.
Thanks, Krsna. So I'm going to talk generally about DACA renewals and also who is eligible to renew now, and try to answer some of those questions around the individuals who USCIS is still accepting DACA applications from, but are not processing, right? So as Krsna explained, the lawsuit and the order given by Judge Hannon and then agreed with, the Fifth Circuit agreed with, and the extension of the injunction has basically left us in this land where DACA renewals continue, people can continue to renew, and USCIS has stated that they're not going to move forward with DACA initials while this injunction and this litigation plays out. And there's been a lot of information and news, right, from the different court orders that might have left some individuals in the community really confused as to who could access renewals, who could still access DACA, and whether there are any benefits for those who are thinking, should I submit my initial because USCIS is accepting it, or should I wait until this whole thing clears out, we get a final decision before I decide to move forward or not move forward? Also, I want to note before I go into some of the details of who is eligible and what is needed to renew, that we have heard there is a decline in renewals. For those of you who work directly with DACA-mentored individuals and DACA-impacted individuals, I'm not sure if you're seeing that as well, but we have heard that people are not coming forward to renew at the moment. So it's definitely, important to get the word out of who is eligible to renew. And also if you know of anybody who has access to help with filing fees, that we get that information out to the community, right? Because we are at this pivotal point of not knowing what the future of DACA is, and unfortunately facing a lot of courts who have not been friendly with DACA, right, in the past. So we want to make sure that we get the word out as to what things DACA recipients could do now and what they could do to plan for their future. Next slide. So who is eligible for DACA, right? As Krsna mentioned, the program, continues to be open for individuals who are eligible to renew DACA, right? So USCIS is accepting and processing and granting DACA renewals. And this is, renewals from individuals who are current DACA recipients. That means that they have a current valid DACA grant, right? They either have a few months left, 2 years left, right? They're using their work permits to work. Those current DACA recipients are eligible to continue renewing. This also includes individuals whose DACA expired less than 1 year ago, right? So anybody whose DACA expired, 8 months ago, 9 months ago, right? 10 months ago, those individuals could come forward and still renew, and USCIS will accept them, will process them, and will either, grant them or deny them, depending on the circumstances of that individual. And these people could come forward and access, right, DACA protections and continue to get, their work permits renew. Next slide. When should these people renew? I think it's another big question right now because of the pending litigation. There's, I've seen questions in the community around whether people should go and renew now, right? For those of you who have been working with DACA recipients for quite some time, we know that back, when we were waiting for the Supreme Court decision, right, around the termination of DACA, there was a big push for people to renew ASAP, right? People were going and renewing with 1 year left on their work permits, even maybe more than 1 year left on their work permits. And a lot of people are wondering whether they should do that now or if they should wait and see what happens, right? Generally, the advice we give and the advice we've seen other legal organizations give is that if you are a DACA recipient or of a DACA recipient whose DACA expires 6 months from now, they should definitely go and renew as soon as possible, right? They want to make sure that USCIS accepts it, that they have time to review it and grant it, answer any questions that might come for more evidence, right? And that they get a grant of DACA before their current DACA expires, right? They don't want any lapse in their DACA, for work purposes, for maybe future other legal options, right? They want to make sure that they have DACA and that they give enough time for those to be processed. The question comes now for those who have maybe more than 6 months on their work permit, right? And those who have maybe more than 1 year on their work permit. generally, right, individuals whose DACA expires maybe 6 months to a year, they could consider renewing, right? They should definitely speak to a service provider or a legal service provider and kind of weigh the positives, right, and the negatives of renewing, right? If they renew now, USCIS is going to grant their new DACA from the day that it's approved, right? So from, let's say that I have 7 months left on my work permit, or 8 months left on my work permit, and USCIS approves my new DACA tomorrow, that's when my new period's going to start, right, from that day of approval. So I'm going to lose some time, right? So it's definitely important to weigh, whether, potentially getting, I don't know, a year and a half more, right? Or a year and 2 months more, et cetera, is worth it, right? Because you do have to pay the $495. Definitely, if you have or know of an agency who could support with filing fees, that definitely changes the conversation, right? Because somebody could help you with that $495, and you could submit the DACA and get a bit more time, right? A bit more security as we wait for this litigation to play out. For those whose DACA expires more than 1 year from now, right? For those, you might want to have a conversation as to whether it'd be worth it, right? Because like I mentioned, you will be approved. Your new DACA grant will start from the day you're approved. So it might not be worth it if you have a year or more to submit a renewal now, since you'll be getting so little time back, right? Maybe you're only gaining 4 months, maybe you're only gaining 5 months, right? So definitely seeing if that's worth it. I think it's more of a worth to renew early if you have less than a year, right, on your DACA, because you're gaining a bit more time than if you have more than a year. But definitely have that conversation with a legal service provider. Encourage DACA recipients to have a conversation with a legal service provider to weigh the benefits, right, the pros and cons of renewing early. We definitely don't want to create a panic in the community, right, of that they need to go renew now because we know that DACA will end tomorrow. Because we don't, right? We don't know when a decision will come. We don't know what the future of the program will look like. But for those who definitely have a DACA that expires, 6 months from now or within the 6 months, they should definitely seek to renew as soon as possible. Next slide. So what's needed to include in your DACA request? This hasn't changed, right? Even with the pending litigation, even with the introduction of the new rule, it's still the same requirements as before, right? Those who are eligible to renew have to show that they had DACA, right, once in the past, that they haven't been charged with any new crime or something that would make them ineligible, that they've never traveled outside the country without advance parole. In order to be able to renew, USCIS requires that individuals submit a complete packet, right? This includes the form for the DACA, the I-821D, and the forms for the work authorization, which is the I-765 and the I-765W, the worksheet that states why someone will need a work permit. The filing fee is still $495, right? And the check or money order could be made to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It's optional to include a G1145, and that will send you text messages or email notifications as to when your application was received and information. And then if the individual's being represented, a G28 to show that they're being represented by an attorney or an accredited rep. Next slide. DACA renewals are now being accepted online. And I've heard mixed feelings about the online requests, right? There are some questions that you have to fill out on the online request that you don't have to necessarily do on the paper form that some people have found questionable, right? But I've also heard really positive things about renewing online, right? Things seem to be processed a lot quicker, right? For individuals. So if they wanted to do that, they definitely can. And you could pay for that either with a debit card or a credit card. And in general, DACA renewals right now are being approved very quickly, right? We did have a slowdown last year where there was a lot of lapse, right? And DACA renewals, there was delays in getting people their new grants. It's been reported in the last couple of months that people are receiving back renewals in 2 to 3 months, sometimes weeks. So those are happening very quickly for people to, to get their renewals. So that's a very good thing. Next slide. And then now, you know, the question comes as to whether those who we know will not be approved, whether they should move forward and file their renewal, right? So individuals who have a DACA that expired over 1 year ago, right? Should they submit a renewal, right? Because we know that USCIS at the moment will not approve them, right? They've issued statements saying that they are treating these as initials, and because of the litigation and the orders, it's been stated that they can't approve initial DACAs, therefore they can approve DACAs that have expired over 1 year ago. So, you know, whether someone should submit and wait, I think will depend on the individual circumstances and facts of that case, right? Why is it that they didn't renew on time, right? Is it some new crime issue? Is it something that they didn't have the filing fee? I think are good questions to discuss with the legal service provider, and also weigh, you know, the risks of submitting more information to USCIS. Maybe there are very few because, you know, USCIS already has your information. Also, whether you want to lose the $495 for however many months, right? Because you have to pay the filing fee, and USCIS is accepting that filing fee. And while we hope that if, you know, if these cannot be approved anymore in the future, that USCIS will return the filing fee to individuals, you know, it's not, we don't know if it's like 100% sure that they'll do it, right? So it's definitely things to discuss. And like I mentioned, you know, USCIS has stated that they will not process any of these until the litigation is resolved. And we don't know how long that will take, right? Like Krsna mentioned, we're waiting on Judge Hannon to issue a decision, right, about the rule itself. That will likely be appealed, right? So we're looking at a very long road. And who knows how, you know, how DACA will look while that is pending. Next slide. For those who are DACA or potential DACA initials, right now there are several DACA initial applications that are stuck with USCIS, right? All those that were not approved before the July order from Texas, those are right now pending, right? There's a lot of individuals who were scheduled for biometrics or were able to do biometrics but never got a final decision. Those are in limbo, right? We don't know if USCIS will be able to process those anytime in the near future. Right now, they've stated that they will not process, right, any initials. So whether someone should submit if they haven't submitted, that's definitely an individual choice. I know some individuals think that if they submit it now, at least their application will be in the pipeline. And if DACA reopens, even if it's for a short period of time, maybe those will be processed sooner. But it's hard to tell whether that will be the case, especially based on what we've seen from the orders. And also, you know, the risks of having your information out there with the government if you haven't, you know, if they have no knowledge of you, is definitely something to think about, right? Because once you submitted, your information will be with USCIS, right? And if DACA closes, there's no benefit you have gained, right? And even though we think that USCIS will return those filing fees, it's not 100% sure, right? So there's also always a possibility of losing those fees. Next slide. All right. So I'll leave that there and I'll turn it over to Krsna to talk about advanced parole.
Great. Thank you, Veronica. I mentioned earlier that so one of the other benefits, as many of you know, with having DACA is the ability to ask for advanced parole. So the ability to travel abroad. And I think especially if we don't know if DACA is ending in the future, we want to make sure that those that are eligible and haven't already traveled abroad do so, not just because it's fun to travel, but because, like I'll talk about in a little bit, there's some benefits to being able to travel abroad and coming back on advanced parole. Next slide, please. So first of all, when we talk about advanced parole, what does that mean? So it means basically asking the government for advance permission to be able to leave and re-enter the United States. And so what ends up happening is that if a person leaves and comes back, they're what's called considered paroled. So instead of someone, for example, coming in unlawfully, now because of that legal entry, they're considered to be paroled into the United States upon returning. So when you're asking for the government for advance parole and they approve your travel, persons receive what's basically on your screen. An example is the form I-512L, which basically is just letting you know that's kind of the evidence that you show upon return that you're able to come back. Advance parole is not unique to DACA, so a lot of other benefits allow immigrants to travel. So people, for example, who are applying for a green card and are waiting to get the green card, they can also ask for advance parole. People for TPS, they can also ask for advance parole. So it's not unique to DACA, but the requirements for DACA are just specific to DACA. And I'll talk about that in the next slides. Next slide, please. So for DACA, in order to travel abroad, it has to be, unfortunately, one of three purposes. That is employment, humanitarian, or an educational purpose. So it can be, for example, just to go have fun. Although you can make the argument that maybe you're going for one of these purposes, and that doesn't mean you can't have fun. You can do whatever you want, as long as one of the purpose for you traveling falls under one of these three. I would say, even though we have these three kind of criteria, it's pretty open-ended. There's no one definition on what employment, humanitarian, or educational purpose means. So you can be creative. But as you can see on the screen, there's some examples. So for an employment purpose, you can say, my job wants me to go abroad to learn more, or there's a conference in some other country that's connected to my job. I want to attend this conference. Or a training, there's a training being held abroad and I want to go to it that's going to help me do my job more efficiently or gain more skills. Meetings, interviews, those are just some examples. You can, again, be creative about how you want to, as long as it's tied to an employment purpose. Humanitarian purpose, I think that's one of the most common things that we see for DACA individuals. Basically, again, it's open-ended, but some of the common examples that we see is you go abroad because, hey, it's costly to get a medical treatment here in the United States because of the medical system that we have. And it's actually a lot cheaper in some other country. And I want to go spend less money on my medical treatment. So I am going to ask for advance parole in order to do that. Also family reasons. So we know a lot of DACA recipients who have grandparents who are very old and they want to go visit them. Other family members who are sick, or even people who have passed away and they want to go visit their tombs. I think, so those are some of the examples that we've seen, but again, very open-ended, just has to be a humanitarian purpose. And then lastly, educational. So we see this a lot for students who are in college or a university and they want to study abroad for a semester. We've seen that a lot. Academic research, maybe they're doing their PhD and they want to go abroad to do some research for that study, or a cultural exchange program. So I saw earlier in the chat that there's some consulate members from the Mexican consulate in some areas. And so the Mexican consulate and other consulates offer these exchange programs for DACA recipients to go back to their countries and learn more about their heritage and their history. So that's another example. And again, very broad, as long as you make the argument that it ties into one of these purposes. Next slide, please. So to apply, you would have to fill out the form I-131, and it's very important for people to not leave without getting permission and getting that approval for advance parole, because I've seen that a few times where a person leaves and then is stuck outside because they now are at risk of their DACA being automatically terminated. So you have to fill out this form I-131, and you have to submit the fee, which is $575, and you submit that to USCIS. Besides that form and the fee, of course, you would be providing evidence that the reason for your travel falls under one of those three reasons. But here are some examples for employment, including letters from the employer saying my employee needs to go for X reason, conference brochures, things like that. For humanitarian, letters from physicians, hospitals, social workers that that kind of show, for example, that the family member is ill or that has passed away or that they're in extreme age. Letters from your family members themselves, things like that. And then for educational, again, like letters from the school or brochures showing the study abroad program, approval of that study abroad program, things like that. Next slide, please. So tips for filing. So again, I think many people have already successfully traveled and returned. So I think that should alleviate that fear. I'll talk about red flags in a little bit. Again, maybe some people might not want to travel, but for the most part, most people are eligible for it and they should be traveling. Right now, the processing times for these under the normal process is 3 to 4 months. So that's something to keep in mind, and possibly even more in some cases. So unlike DACA renewals, I think travel advance parole forms are taking a little bit longer. But if a person does need to travel under an emergency basis, there is a process for that. So you can actually call USCIS to make an in-person appointment where you can take your application to a nearby USCIS office and they'll review it right there and then, and if approved, you can pay there. So if the person does need to travel on an emergency basis, they can request that appointment. Otherwise, you're just submitting it to the office under a paper form. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned, there are some risks to consider for traveling, and for some people, the risk might be greater. So we'll talk about those in the next slides. Next slide, please. So one thing to keep in mind is that just receiving an advance parole approval by itself does not mean that when you come back and at the border, when you're in front of a CBP officer, for example, that they are going to allow you to come back in, because that's not how it works. Like I mentioned, when you're applying for advance parole, all you have to show is that you're eligible under those three criteria. So what they're not doing is actually going through your background and seeing, for example, if you have a criminal conviction or things like that. That's not what's happening when you're asking for advance parole. All that screening happens when you're coming back and now you're facing an officer. That's when they're doing that in-depth screening to see if you're actually allowed to come back in. So it's important for some people to make sure that they're eligible to come back in. So we advise for some cases to consult with an expert, to talk to a legal practitioner, especially if a person has been deported in the past. If they've had any contact with ICE whatsoever, sometimes they don't know that contact with an ICE agent led to a removal order. Or again, if the person has been arrested or convicted of a crime, they want to just make sure that they talk to an attorney or a legal practitioner to see if any of that would risk them from being not allowed back in when they return. Next slide, please. Um, Also, things to keep in mind, COVID-19 is still a thing. Depending on the country that you're traveling to, making sure that you know what their requirements are. COVID can continue to impact international travel. Some countries are still banning other countries from even entering. Some are requiring that you have a testing before you enter. And then some are requiring you to have a vaccination, or vaccination is highly encouraged. So it depends on what country you're traveling to. So make sure that they're also just looking at those requirements of whatever the country they're planning to visit. Next slide, please. And then returning to the United States. So when returning to the United States, right now, the requirement is if you're a non-citizen or a non-immigrant, so meaning, for example, if you don't have a green card or you're not a citizen, you have to have proof of full vaccination. So that includes DACA recipients. So if they're not vaccinated, that's a big worry. They need to show proof that they're fully vaccinated upon return to the United States. That's not the case for US citizens or green card holders or other things like that. But for DACA recipients, they have to have full vaccination. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, and then, so I was looking at the requirements for what does full vaccination mean. It just means either the 2 vaccinations for Moderna, for example, or the 1 for Pfizer. It doesn't include boosters. So you just have to show that you had the initial vaccinations. Now some tips for when they're traveling from abroad. Next slide. So always make sure to carry your unexpired DACA approval notice and your EAD along with the original Events Pro approval notice, and make sure to have copies of those, because you can imagine sometimes people lose things. So we always encourage folks to not only have the originals, but to have extra copies in case they get lost in their travel. And again, we do encourage folks to have a consultation with an immigration expert, especially with those persons who think that they have a removal order or some kind of criminal contact with law enforcement. We just want to make sure that they're going to be able to come back. Next slide, please. Also be mindful of which airport you choose to fly back to. Unfortunately, we know that it varies how CBP officers treat immigrants based on each state. So we know, for example, that unfortunately CBP officers in Texas are probably a lot more harsh. So if you don't want to go through that extra hassle of dealing with those types of officers, you might want to choose where to fly back to, especially if it's a connecting flight. Obviously, you might not be able to choose if you live in Texas, but oftentimes you can choose the connecting flight, and sometimes you don't want to land in Florida or Texas. No offense to the people in those states, but CBP officers usually tend to be a lot more harsher in certain areas. Also be prepared. I think there's a lot of new officers. You'll be surprised at how many times DACA recipients say, hey, like this CBP officer didn't even know what DACA was. So be prepared as a DACA recipient to explain to immigration officers what DACA is and that you're allowed to come back in. Sometimes you're sent to secondary inspection. So that's fairly common, where you come back and at the border, that officer, once again, doesn't know what DACA is. So they send you to an extra room. That's pretty common. It doesn't mean that they're going to get deported. It just means that they need to do an extra screening to make sure that the person is able to come back in. And oftentimes in the majority of cases, they allow them to come back in. Also be careful and be mindful of what you have on your phone. Unfortunately, the laws at the border are a lot more relaxed. for CBP officers to be able to search your phone. So unlike inside of the United States, where, for example, they need probable cause, they don't need that at the border. So they can easily just search your belongings, search your phone. So that means be careful what you're storing, the pictures that you have. You want to erase anything that says that you were smoking weed, for example, or things like that. You don't want to have that in your belongings or on your phone. Next slide. All right, so now the biggest thing is that besides obviously having fun with advance parole, there's a huge benefit for people, and especially if DACA ends, we want to make sure that those people have this benefit. Next slide. So getting a green card. So a quick overview of being able to get a green card through a United States citizen family member. So generally, basically people who are inside of the United States, in order to obtain their green card, generally speaking, the person has to complete the process outside of the United States. And this can cause problems, especially for people who are here unlawfully before they receive DACA after their 18th year birthday. If you've been here unlawfully for more than 6 months, that can cause problems. More than 6 months and definitely more than a year of being unlawful after your 18th birthday and not having DACA, and you have to go outside of the country, that can bar you from coming back. So that's generally the process. But some people who are eligible for what's called adjustment of status can seek a green card inside of the United States. And so to be eligible for adjustment of status, one of the ways is to have come back or to enter the country lawfully. We know a lot of times DACA recipients, when they were little, came unlawfully, they crossed the border, so they don't have a legal entry. So one of the benefits with advance parole is that, like I mentioned, you're considered paroled into the United States when you return. So even though if you originally came to the country unlawfully, if you go and return on advance parole, hey, now you have this legal entry. So that means that DACA recipients who have a US citizen spouse, a US citizen son or daughter who's over 21, or if you have a parent who's a US citizen and you're under 21 and you have that legal entry, those people can complete the process inside of the United States to get their green card, and they don't have to worry about leaving the country to complete the process. So that's why it's a huge benefit. You have that legal entry. Even if DACA ends, it's not going to get rid of that legal entry. So again, encourage folks to travel on advance parole if they can. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass it over to Veronica to talk about more permanent options for DACA recipients.
Thanks. So I think something really good that could be done right now while we wait to see what happens with DACA is encourage individuals who have DACA or even individuals who don't have DACA to get screened for other immigration options. As you know, DACA is something that does not lead to a permanent protection, right? It's we can think of it as like a circular thing, right? Where an individual becomes eligible for DACA, they get approved, they could renew, right? And then they wait and then they renew again, but it doesn't generally lead to a green card or a permanent protection, right? And as we've seen with, the litigation, the back and forth, people who have DACA right now are kind of in limbo, right? Waiting to see what happens next. For those people, if they can get screened, they should get screened, even if they've been screened at some time in the past. It's always great to get screened again because things change, facts change, and they might be eligible for something now that they might not have been in the past. A great example is what Krsna went over, right? Someone who traveled on advanced parole, maybe before they weren't eligible to adjust status and get a green card here in the United States, but now with that entry on advanced parole, maybe they are now, right? So they should talk to someone pretty regularly to see what options are available to them. Next slide. So in the United States, there's various ways that someone could obtain a green card. Most common we hear are family-based petitions, right? So someone is either petitioned by their spouse, their parent, their son or daughter, in order for them to start the process to become a green card holder, right? And we can think of this process as a two-step process, right? The first step is having that vehicle that will get you on the road to a green card, right? That first step is having someone or some way that you could get that visa petition in. And once you have that visa petition in that leads to a green card, then you would move to the second step in completing the process of becoming a lawful permanent resident or obtaining your green card, right? The most common way we know this is the family-based process, right? That family-based petition is the first step in getting you on the road to become a green card holder. There are other ways that people obtain this, right? Another common way is employment-based, right, visas, where someone who, you know, is being petitioned by their employer, right? And that leads to a green card. We also have, you know, commonly the humanitarian options. These include things like asylum, right? Or visas for victims of crimes or survivors of crime, like human trafficking, or, you know, a U visa, you know, victims of domestic violence or survivors of domestic violence. These types of visas, right, all lead to a green card, right? So it gets someone on that path towards a green card. And, you know, and people should be screened for this, right? Have they been a victim of something, or have they survived something that might potentially make them eligible for one of these humanitarian forms of relief? The other way is a diversity visa, right? That's usually for people who come from historically underrepresented countries, right? That haven't had high rates of immigration in recent years. It's like a lottery. It's less common, right, for people to come through diversity. So if you have, you know, someone that's a DACA recipient, it would be good to screen to see if they would fall to any of these and, you know, become eligible for a green card. Next slide. So common forms of relief we see, right, especially with young DACA recipients or DACA recipients are, you know, some of them might be working with certain employers who have the ability to petition them. It's, you know, encouraged that if you don't have that, you know, employment-based knowledge, right, or employment-based immigration, to make a connection with someone who might have that in order to screen some DACA recipients to see if they would be eligible for an employment-based visa. Some undocumented folks, you know, might be eligible, right, because they have an old petition or they've now traveled on advanced parole, and it kind of changes the dynamics as to whether they could complete that process here or they would be eligible for that process here. You know, people who have now married to U.S. citizens, right? Maybe they will be eligible for adjustment of status or even consular processing where they have to leave the country, right? Because they have that U.S. citizen who could petition them and help them get any waivers that might be needed for them to complete their application. Like I mentioned, you know, maybe individuals might be eligible for a U visa, right? Because they've been a victim of a crime here in the United States and they've worked with law enforcement in order to get that process going, that they could use that to submit a U visa application. The U visa will lead to a green card, though it has a very, very long wait right now, right? People who are submitting a U visa, there's about a 10-year wait, but it does lead to a green card eventually. And USCIS is working right now to hopefully get some of these U visa applicants a work permit sooner, right, while they wait for the process. Also, if you work with someone who has expressed any fear of returning to their home country, there's definitely, you know, an opportunity to explore some asylum-based options. And then lastly, right, because we're talking about a population when we think about DACA of individuals who came when they were very young, right? It's definitely important to do any follow-up or questions around parents' applications. You know, in immigration law, as Krsna explained, when you are trying to adjust status, you have to show that you were admitted, right, or that you were paroled, right? Advanced parole solves that, right? So DACA recipients who traveled on advanced parole that could potentially become eligible for adjustment of status if they have a U.S. citizen who could start the family-based process for them. For young people, right, there's this other thing that if they have, you know, if their parents had an old application filed for them before April of 2001, they could potentially be 245I eligible and protected, and that also would allow them to become eligible for adjustment of status, right? Pending meeting all the other requirements. But it's definitely worth asking to see if there's that old petition, that their parents might have, started, right? Maybe their parents had, their parents' parents, right? So their grandparents now submitted an old petition for their parents, and the child was, already born and they're included in that, or maybe an uncle submitted a petition for their father, et cetera, right? So it's worth exploring to see what old petitions exist in the family, and letting the DACA recipient know that they should explore these things with their family to see if that would make them eligible for some sort of permanent relief. Next slide. And when having these conversations with folk, or encouraging, individuals to think about their own immigration history, or as they prepare to go talk to an immigration attorney or a BIA accredited rep, it's definitely good to discuss some of these questions with them, right? So, are they afraid of returning to their home country? Why are they afraid of returning to their home country, right? Explore if anything has happened to family members who are still in their home country to see if they would be eligible for asylum, right? Also exploring whether someone has been the victim of a crime in the United States and that has been reported to the police, or maybe if it hasn't been reported to the police, why wasn't it? And is it still possible to report that to the police? Because that might make them eligible for a U visa. The U visa also has a very generous waiver, right? So sometimes we find clients or individuals who are not eligible for anything else because of certain immigration violations, but they might be eligible for a U visa. So exploring that, exploring whether someone has been forced to do work without pay, right? Or maybe how they were brought into the United States, or some sort of relationship they had in the past. There was some sort of forced work or forced labor, right, that might make them eligible for a T visa. Also exploring if these, individuals have been hurt by a family member who has status, right? So we have, a lot of individuals who are part of mixed status families, where some of them have, are green card holders or US citizens, right? And where others are not. And exploring whether that, has there been any violence in that, right, relationship that would make someone eligible for VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, which is an option for people who have been harmed, right, by a US citizen or LPR spouse or child, right, or a parent, right? So it's definitely, good to explore that. Also, if someone is in removal proceedings or has been in removal proceedings, in the case that DACA ends, right, is there any sort of remedy that they could get in court, right, like cancellation of removal for non-LPRs? And then also, as has been discussed, right, if this DACA recipient traveled on advanced parole, does that make him eligible for something else? Do they have an old application that can make him eligible for something else? Next slide. And then, for those of you who work with DACA recipients, as you know, people have been submitting their DACA applications now for over 10 years, right? So a lot of people maybe haven't had contact with an immigration attorney or a BIA accredited rep, and have been doing the process on their own. I think for these individuals, it's important to contact them if you have, an ability to do so, and remind them that they should, one, renew if they haven't done that, right, and think about renewing, but two, get screened for options, even if they've done it in the past, just because things change, facts change, and those things might make them eligible for something more permanent in the future. Also, think about strategies if someone moves forward with submitting an immigration application, right? What the risks of submitting that, what are the benefits of submitting that? Are there any red flags to take into consideration? And also, partner with different organizations or firms, right, that have knowledge of different types of immigration, right, to help, DACA recipients get screened for all options. I think most commonly, a lot of nonprofits that work with DACA recipients, we tend to be more of a family-based, right, oriented. We don't do employment-based. So it's good, to partner with those firms, organizations that might have that knowledge, so that we thoroughly screen DACA recipients. And then understanding, what's happening at home, even if someone hasn't been there for many, many years, seeing what's happened, if anything has changed, any incidents have happened. And then, as always, it's great and, beneficial to request any records of DACA recipients. A lot of times things get submitted, right? And they might not know exactly what's in their record, right? So if they don't have a copy of those things that were submitted, get a record to see what immigration has on the applicant before anybody moves forward, right? Because you want to know exactly what's there and see if there's anything that would harm an individual moving forward. For DACA, you don't get screened for all those inadmissibility grounds that people do when they actually move forward to submit an immigration application, right? DACA has its own kind of set of requirements, and some things that would not make someone ineligible for DACA will make them ineligible for permanent immigration relief. So you want to understand that applicants, full immigration packet, for full immigration history as they move forward, as they get screened, to ensure that they're getting all the correct information and that they're submitting the best application petition possible, right? And understanding those differences of what makes someone eligible for DACA and what would make someone eligible for something else, right? And what might trigger certain, bad situations, right? In immigration, seeking immigration, permanent immigration relief versus seeking DACA. So understanding that, and then, like always, just encouraging people to think about these questions as they prepare to go forward to speak with an immigration attorney. Sometimes it's a little intimidating, right? People don't know what exactly is required of them to bring to a consultation, right? What kind of information might be required. And the more information you bring, the better of a consultation, of a screening you could do of an applicant. So if you have those records, definitely bring them. If you have those full petitions, definitely bring them so that you could get the best information possible. Next slide. Okay, so I will pass it over to Krsna.
Great. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about, how can, as a DACA recipient, if DACA ends especially, how can you earn a living even without having this work authorization? So we're going to talk about some of the cool stuff that's been happening by our partner organizations and other advocates who have been kind of exploring this area even before DACA was even a thing. Next slide. So one of the things that I want to talk about is that just recently, I think a few weeks ago, the University of California here in the state of California announced that they're trying to pressure the whole UC system. So that's like our kind of universities throughout the state to hire undocumented students. And so a group of UCLA law professors got together and basically put out this legal memo arguing that that the state of California and not just the state of California, but any state can actually hire undocumented workers. So their argument is basically that there's a current federal law that does prohibit hiring undocumented workers, but that law only applies to persons and certain entities and the federal government, but it does not apply to the state. So it's a unique argument. This is the first time that I'm seeing someone at this level push this out. So we're keeping an eye out to see what the University of California decides. Obviously, the University of California is tied to the state, but this could apply to any kind of state entity. And for that reason, anything outside of a person, certain entities like corporations or the federal government, they could potentially hire undocumented workers. So next slide, please. So I mentioned this law. Basically, there's a federal law in 1986. Many of you know IRCA, or the amnesty law, that allowed a lot of undocumented people at that time to get a green card. But some people don't know that that same law also created this criminal provision for the first time, that anyone who any person or entity that hires an undocumented worker, it could be criminally punishable. So that's why, for the most part, a lot of people are saying, hey, I don't want to hire undocumented workers because I could get criminally punished. So that's that 1986 law. But again, the University of California is arguing that that law does not apply to states. So we'll see where that goes. That could be a huge deal if they're able to get that through. Next slide, please. Also, I mean, so I mentioned there's that law, but that law also means that there's other ways of earning a living lawfully where you don't have to be employed by someone. You can do your own thing. So our partners at Immigrants Rising, it's a nonprofit that's based here in San Francisco, and they're comprised of a lot of undocumented individuals and also a lot of DACA recipients who have been looking at this, like I said, even before DACA was implemented, where they help people earn a living through different ways. So they talk about how you can be doing independent contracting. So you're self-employed. That law doesn't apply to you. You can earn a living that way by just doing independent contracting. You can do consulting. You can create your own business so that you don't have to be employed. You can be your own employer. You could be the employer. So creating LLCs, C corporations, things like that. That all sounds scary, but it's pretty easy to do. And that organization, Immigrants Rising, helps people to start creating those on their own and has a lot of trainings and resources for that. But yeah, so those are some of the ways that people could earn a living, even if DACA were to end. I mean, they could do that with DACA too, but in case they don't have the ability to be lawfully employed, again, by an entity or the federal government, they can be their own employer or they can be self-employed. Next slide. So yeah, so as I mentioned, Immigrants Rising has been doing this for a very long time, and they talk about the undocu hustle, and it's basically kind of their kind of slogan for just realizing that even after DACA was passed, many people came to the country who were young, especially, and who have that spirit of being entrepreneurial. So that's why they are providing a lot of resources to make sure that these folks know about these ways of earning a living. So with that, I will pass it back to Vero to talk to us about legislation before we go into Q&A.
Thanks. So lastly, we wanted to end with any possible legislation. We saw a lot of push, right, and a lot of potential legislation introduced at the beginning of the Biden administration. And things were put up, right, to see if they were passed by the House, if they were to be passed by the Senate. Unfortunately, none of that got much traction, right? And a lot of efforts were not successful, right? So we're still now at the end of year 2 of the Biden administration without any new, comprehensive, inclusive immigration reform that would allow people to apply for status, right, who are here in the country. Next slide. With the possible ending of DACA, there have been talks again about potentially reintroducing the DREAM Act, right, and seeing if that passes so that DACA eligible individuals would be able to access permanent status here in the United States. That hasn't seen a lot of traction in the last, few days, right? We haven't had, or last couple of months, we haven't had any, notable news as to whether this is going to actually be put up for a vote, right? If what would be included in a potential DREAM Act. There's not, unfortunately, a lot of hope, right, that something will happen in Congress based on what we've seen in the past. There's a lot of work being done by organizations and coalitions to get something through Congress, especially in these last 2 months or month and a half of the year, because, we're in midterm elections, right, and there's not a lot of hope that the Democrats will hold on to their small lead right now that they have. So they're trying to see if something will pass before there's that change. There were talks about updating this old portion of the law registry where they would update the date as to when someone would have to have been in the United States, and that would make them eligible to apply for permanent relief, right? Or, get a green card through that. Talks on that, there haven't been a lot of talks on where that is in recent years. There are efforts being taken right now for people to call specific Republicans, right, to see if they could get something pushed, and asks of the Biden administration to get something passed that would continue to give protection to DACA recipients. And there are coalitions who are working specifically for these DACA recipients, or with the mind of DACA recipients, but asking for an inclusive, right, legislative solution for immigrants in general, that are doing the work to see if they could get something through, Congress. Like I mentioned, there isn't a lot of traction in any of this, unfortunately. And with midterm elections, a lot of people think that Republicans will have, take the hold of Congress again. And there's not much hope in that, of getting something passed. We could share some links to organizations that are doing advocacy around this. I think most notably is the Home is Here campaign that's kind of has been together, working on, DACA issues and advocacy since we had the first Supreme Court decision, right? The first termination of DACA, that's led by United We Dream, that are organizing efforts to reach out to Congress to hopefully get something out there and, available before the end of the year. But like I mentioned, we have about 2 months left. So who knows what will happen, especially with, the holidays, and then midterm elections. So, we don't have, unfortunately, a lot of positive news to share on this. But with that, thank you so much for listening to us for the last, hour and a half or so. And we'll definitely open it up to any questions that you all might have.
Thank you both so much. That was a lot of really great information, and also inspired a lot of really great questions. So I'll just jump in. I'll start reading out some of those questions for you so everybody can kind of hear what was asked, and then we'll see what kind of thoughts you might have to share with us. First of all, a couple of people did ask about being able to access this recording and all of that great information you shared in your presentation. So I just wanted to say again that we'll send out a link to the recording and also a copy of the slides to all the registrants of the webinar in the next couple of days. One question that we did receive asked about something that Krsna mentioned. Where can we learn more about the programs that you mentioned regarding Mexican consulates allowing DACA recipients to visit Mexico to learn more about the culture and the country? Is that something that you can provide a little more info on?
Yeah, so usually, I would just encourage folks to reach out to their local consulates. There's also a few Facebook groups that are just for DACA recipients who are talking about Events Pro. So you just literally go to Facebook and search Events Pro DACA. You'll find all these groups where they're sharing flyers. If not, I know the Mexican consulate for sure is always having these kind of programs. So I would just go to the Mexican consulate's website.
Okay, great. Thank you. We had a few questions related to advanced parole. Someone asked, considering current governors, would Arizona also be a state to avoid if returning on advanced parole? And if there's a list anywhere that would have DACA and immigrant-friendly arrival states? And a second question, someone asked, if a DACA recipient has a terminal illness like cancer and would like to travel to visit family members, would that be considered humanitarian parole? Could you speak to those questions for us?
Yeah, Vero, do you want to take one of those?
Sure, I could take the individual who has cancer. I think for that, it's definitely I think there's definitely a good argument to make about a humanitarian parole, especially around visiting family members who you haven't seen in a very long time and needing to visit with them because of, not having that much time to visit with them. Oftentimes when we think about, in this case, someone is ill, right? And they could use that to, to submit their application as to why they deserve to be granted advance parole. But a lot of times we think of humanitarian as only being if someone is ill, right? That you have to have that visit, but it could also include things like, having a family member who you have a close relationship with, who you haven't seen in a really long time, right? Or being part of some sort of family event, that's really, that would be very beneficial to you, right? And including that information as to why you should be granted a chance to visit. I think that, showing, why you have to visit and who you're going to visit and how long you haven't seen them could definitely help this applicant.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think the person meant humanitarian under advance parole, like the humanitarian purpose, because humanitarian parole is like something different that that's not advance parole, and that exists, but you have to be outside of the country in order to you're basically asking to come back to come into the country on humanitarian parole, and you can apply for humanitarian parole if you're inside of the United States. And then the other question, I don't know too much. I don't think there's a list necessarily on like what's friendly or what's not. I think we just know from some of the interactions that DACA recipients have had that some areas, especially if they're red, more Republican leaning states, that sometimes CBP officers could be a little bit harsher, but I don't know. I think the best kind of tip is just to kind of be aware that happens, that could happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. If you're eligible to come back, if you have that advance parole approval and you have DACA, even if they question you, they should legally be able to allow you to come back in.
Okay, thank you. We had several questions about the potential for a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients, and Veronica just gave us a lot of great information about various legislative options that are in the works or could potentially be in the works. So I just wanted to double check if there was anything in particular that you think should be reiterated, or someone else also asked about advocacy around that sort of pathway, and if there are ways that you know of that they might be able to engage on this issue that you'd want to share. And I'll just add also, I'll share again the link to the DACA explainer that Welcoming America created. It has links to some of the organizations that Veronica talked about, like United We Dream, who are doing some of this advocacy work. But I don't know if there's anything else that either of you would want to say about a pathway to citizenship or any advocacy around that.
Yeah, I would just add, definitely use those links and connect to organizations that are doing the work. I think it's really important to definitely like push and be bold in what we're asking, right, about our representatives, and to definitely do, as much of a united push as possible, right, to show them that we are united in what we want and what we're asking. And I know that right now, some of these orgs are focusing on calling these Republicans, right, to see if there could be any traction there. So if you have the capacity, right, and are able to do that, I would definitely encourage people to do that. And this is not directly, connected to a pathway to citizenship, right, at a federal level. But if you have connections with organizations that are doing like local advocacy, and like local immigrant-friendly policies, that's also definitely a good space to do work in. Because as we see, the federal government doesn't move sometimes a lot, right? And we might have more of a chance to push, friendly immigrant policies at a local base, at least for now, as we wait to see what happens.
Great advice. And we are always talking to folks about, kind of both federal and state and local advocacy and what we can do. So definitely agree. There was a question about whether there's a national organization that specializes or that you recommend for knowledge on employment-based petitions. I do see in the chat that a couple folks have said that they are folks who might be able to do that. So I don't know if there's anything else, Krsna and Veronica, that you would want to add, but I would encourage folks maybe to look at that in the chat as well, if that might be helpful to them.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I don't think there's a national organization that's specifically focused on employment-based visas, but I think the best thing to do is there are a lot of private firms, a lot of private practitioners, like the folks that mentioned that they do this kind of work in your area. So I would just reach out to them and have these discussions with local immigration private firms who generally tend to do these kind of visas.
Great. We had another question that was about in-state tuition for DACA recipients. It didn't ask in particular what the person was hoping to find out about in-state tuition. We know that policies on accessibility to in-state tuition and state financial aid vary from state to state. But I don't know if there's any other information that you might want to share on that subject, or if you have gotten this type of question previously and maybe you have kind of a more cogent understanding of what was being asked than maybe I do.
Yeah, Vero, you can add if you have more information, but I know NELC has a map of the different states and whether they have in-state tuition policies. They also have a map about licenses, like which states allow undocumented folks to get licenses. So I would just check out nelc.org. They have a lot more information on in-state tuition. And then here in California, Immigrants Rising also has a lot of resources around how to support students who are undocumented.
I'll also add maybe that link that we shared with our explainer also includes a link to an organization or a website, the Higher Education Immigration Portal, that has a lot of data and policy analysis and resources about state-specific information about tuition and financial aid. And that's led in partnership, I think, with Immigrants Rising and some other folks that Welcoming America frequently partners with, the American Immigration Council and World Education Services. So the link to that is in the chat in our DACA explainer as well. And I know we are coming up on time, so I'll maybe ask just one other question that was asked. Krsna said earlier that the current litigation around DACA isn't presently before the Supreme Court, but someone asked if the Supreme Court were to rule against continuing DACA in the future, what might happen to current DACA recipients or people that are eligible to apply. And so just wondering if there's anything else that you would want to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, if the Supreme Court, if it gets appealed all the way there and then they say, yeah, the rule is also unlawful, the memo is unlawful, then that would probably be the end of the DACA program. But that doesn't mean that the administration can't do other things. So I mentioned earlier, there's other benefits that they can think about if they can't. I mean, obviously we want to hope that there's a pathway to citizenship, but if that doesn't happen, at the very least, announcing a new program like temporary protected status, deferred enforced departure, there's like all these other kind of programs that they could probably announce to protect these people. And we hope that that's the case.
Thank you. Yes, always good to end on a hopeful note that we're not just down to one single option. So that ends our time. I just want to say thank you again, Krsna and Veronica, for sharing all that really great information with us and for sharing your time with us today. As a reminder, again, the webinar has been recorded. So in the coming days, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a copy of the slides. And if you have any questions about this webinar or any of our other webinars or events, you can contact us at events@welcomingamerica.org. And we would also invite you to follow us on our social media channels and subscribe to our YouTube channel and connect with us on LinkedIn. And on behalf of our speakers and everyone at Welcoming America, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
All right. Thank you all.